If you love theater, then surely there was a play that changed your life. So that's the question the American Theater Wing posed to 19 of America's most distinguished and creative playwrights. We asked them to identify the particular moment of inspiration when they were called to the theater. The results are compiled in our new book, The Play That Changed My Life, edited by Ben Hodges. Hello, I'm Howard Sherman, Executive Director of the American Theater Wing, and we're joined today by two of those 19 playwrights, Tina Howe and Diana Son. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
When we embarked on the book, and I started telling people the title, there was an assumption made by many people that what we were asking you was the play of your own that changed your life. And certainly from the outside, people would say to you, well, it must have been Stop Kiss, and perhaps to you, painting churches. But maybe that's a false assumption. So let me ask you that other question. What was the play of your own that changed your life? Diana.
Well, I mean, I would also answer Stop Kiss, although really I could look at every play, and say that this play changed my life because it brought on, the next thing. But because I came from, really different from Tina, I came from a background where I did not see theater, I wasn't exposed to plays, that every experience really, even up till now, seems to me transformative.
But in your career, I mean, when Stop Kiss was done at the Public in 98, I believe?
Yeah, 98, 99.
Was it that single production? Because it was also taken up and done by many theaters after that. So was it the experience of that production and the way it broke through in here in New York, or was it realizing that it was breaking through across the country? And how did you react to that?
Right. I mean, both. I mean, certainly, the good reviews and all that stuff brought people to see the play, who didn't otherwise know my work. And from there, those subsequent productions, also just took my work, beyond New York City, which is so important, if you want to be, a working playwright.
Tina, what was the play for you?
My experience is the exact reverse. I think the play that changed my life, my play, was my second play, Birth and Afterbirth, which explored the tension between the women who choose to have children and the women who don't, because I wrote it in the 70s at a time when women seemed to be divided in terms of either being domestic or having careers. And my German sister-in-law said to me after my 5 years of marriage and not having any children, she said, "Tina, you are not a woman until you have the children." And I thought, oh, wait a minute, I don't know about that. And I think somebody has to write a play about this because it's such a painful, complicated, thorny, horrendous, sort of dilemma. And so I wrote this play, sort of inspired by UNESCO, that was pushed into the realms of absurdity, in which there were two couples sort of vying with each other. The first couple have a 4-year-old child who's played by a large, hairy man. And the second couple are childless, but they are anthropologists who study children in primitive cultures. It was a very wild play, so wild that when my agent submitted it to every self-respecting theater in the country, it was turned down again and again and again, and it did not see the light of day for 23 years. And so what I learned, that play taught me that I cannot put on the mantle of somebody like UNESCO and examine female rituals and female situations and hope to have a career in the theater, because it's too incendiary. And from that moment on, I started writing my well-mannered white glove plays and minding my manners and being a lady.
You said it was 23 years before it was produced. When it finally got produced, and after you'd done all of your white glove plays, as you call them, did you go back and rework the piece, or was it still the piece essentially
I
that
did
you'd written?
rework it because the end wasn't quite right, and I knew that I had to, get back into the world of the play, and I was offered one of these sort of work things where you're invited to a university to work on a play and teach and have the play be read. And so this gave me an opportunity to work on it. And meanwhile, both the Wilma Theater and the Woolly Mammoth wanted to do it. So I had, productions looming. And I have to say, I had wonderful productions, but each one was viciously attacked. For being outre, and doesn't Tina know that absurdism has had its heyday, it's dead and gone, and doesn't she know that one doesn't behave like this on the stage, and when is she going to pull herself together and go back and write the sorts of plays that we love? So for me, that play and sort of exploring my inner, darker, frisky side made it clear that I had to watch it. A sad story.
For how long? How long did you feel like you had to watch it?
I still feel that way, and I'm very aware of my plays that I call my white glove plays that are well behaved, with vaguely alcoholic wasps drifting up and down New England beaches reciting Yeats and being charming and in a way being harmless in their charm because they don't have power anymore, and being eccentric and verbal, and there's something, I think because it's a vanishing breed, I think audiences love to spend time with them. But the minute I go back into, female experience of having babies or of being a wife, or I wrote a play about an older woman falling in love with a younger man, and that play has never been done by anyone because there's something so scandalous about the image of a young man in the arms of an older woman.
Yet it seems almost that that's a topic now that's popular in the media.
In the movies.
And my God, and Harold and Maude years ago
in
even
the
dealt with
movies.
that.
But I think in the theater, and it's a comedy. I mean, the woman is not a virago. She doesn't have pointed teeth, and she's not a cradle robber.
She's not a cougar.
Right, and there's no blood. No blood is shed. If anything, she's going through menopause, so she's very dizzy and getting hot flashes and laughing and sort of collapsing and leaking in the corner. So she's a complete mess. She's the playwright, and he's the young leading man. Because I'm talking too much. I'll stop.
No, it's interesting, and it raises questions of, when you have success, when a certain play or a certain style of play achieves success for you, are you expected to continue to mine that? I mean, it's interesting with Stop Kiss, I've read comments from you that, there were expectations that in fact, well, first the issue of people assumed that you were gay because you had written a play which dealt with female relationships, and whether that informed that when you went on to something else, were people looking for more along the same line, or were you free to explore whatever you wanted to explore in your next work?
I think it must have been a pretty conscious decision to write something different, just because I don't know about you, Tina, but I really bristle when the assumption is made that what you've written about is autobiographical. Of course, we're always in our characters somewhere, but just the idea that literally people wanted to know, like, did this happen to you? Are you gay? Were you attacked? And of course I wanted to write with authenticity, but I also thought that, when I was a little girl and I wanted to become a writer, it was because I like to use my imagination.
Yes.
And and now as an adult writer, I feel like what makes me a writer is that I'm creative. I can make something out of nothing. And so it was a kind of irritating experience. Irritating. I understood where people were coming from, but I also felt that it was somehow demeaning me as an artist. And so, it took some time for me to write my next play because I had a child in between. But when I wrote Satellites, first of all, topically, it was just a little bit more of interest to me because I had started a family, and the couple in Satellites have just had a baby, and for me, having a child, my husband's Caucasian, and so we had this, beautiful Eurasian boy, and it sort of made me think about like, what, onto whom I passed on some features. He's got black hair, and he's got kind of not quite, round eyes, and I thought like, well, what am I passing on besides my genes? what of my legacy and my own background. I grew up I had a very Americanized childhood. So that was really vital to me. So I did want to write about that. But I also consciously knew that, I was writing something really different from Stop Kiss, and that I wanted to do that. I wanted to show, I'm an artist.
It's interesting that you talk about, what's you and what's the character. I mean, David Henry Hwang wrote a play last year, Yellowface, in which he made himself a character. Yet, it's the facts of the play are not. They are partially true and they're partially false, and he's pretty good about being cagey about which parts are real and which parts are fiction. Do you, at any time in your writing, actively say, I want to put some part of myself into this character or this story beyond the outline of, say, a couple that has just had a child?
I've written a series of 10-minute plays and one-act plays because theaters and actors say there aren't enough parts for women, and can you write us plays, for young women or old women? And I find that all of my short plays are all about myself. It's very embarrassing because I think what I enjoy more than anything else is making fun of myself and showing myself as a fool who is completely overwhelmed. And so I have these 7 little plays about this large, leaking Tina character, and nothing gives me more pleasure than seeing actors perform these plays and seeing myself failing over and over again. But in the end, there's always a transformation, and in the end, the leaking Tina character always becomes something titanic, and so I get great enjoyment out of doing that. But I think with the longer plays, one of the things that seems to me about being a playwright, the joy and the power comes from, number one, being able to rewrite your past, and number two, being able to decorate your fantasies. And so that becomes huge, so that you can take, for instance, with painting churches, when people would ask me, is this autobiographical? I developed this very coy, meaningless response. It's all true, but none of it happened, which really doesn't mean anything at all.
But it's a great soundbite.
Yeah, it is a great soundbite. But I was able to take my situation of being, this is so pathetic, of being sort of the unloved child in terms of me and my brother, of being the one that was kind of hidden and under the radiator, and flipping it around and trying to make my parents see me, and I changed everything. I changed, what I did. I changed the nature of my parents, but it was basically a play about a young woman struggling to be seen and struggling to be appreciated. And in the course of writing it, I began understanding why my mother in particular was so unhappy, and why she was such a sort of a problematic mother. And I got very moved by realizing, this poor woman in a way didn't have a chance because of how she grew up. And so what began as an attempt to sort of expiate and get rid of my own feelings of unworthiness turned into something completely different, about being able to understand and forgive my mother. And so, it was about me rewriting a past that I never quite had. And I think there's a tremendous feeling of joy and power in that's something that's always available to us. And you look at Tennessee Williams and you see that I think he does that over and over and over again.
I love Tina's use of the word leaking, because I think
I wanted to ask
yeah.
actually what you mean by that.
Oh, really? Can I tell what
Please.
I think it means is it's that it's unconscious and out of your control.
Please.
And you can't stop it. I think, for example, in Satellites, that was the first time I really specified that the character was Korean American, right? Because she hires this Korean nanny because she wants the baby to hear Korean and stuff. And then her husband is African American, and they've moved to this sort of gentrifying neighborhood in Brooklyn that was, formerly African American. And some people, because I actually did move to Brooklyn, and at the time I wrote that I had 1 child. I have 3 now, but people just assume that this was my play, that I wrote about this, that my husband, my husband said, like, is everyone going to think I'm African American, just like they thought you were gay, after Stop Kiss? And I said, probably, But as I said before, there was a very real issue for me in terms of like what I was really thinking about, raising my son every day is, what am I passing on, And that is really the dilemma of the female character in that play. But I never felt like I was writing about me. I think if I did, I would never have been able to write that play. I'm not interested in spending 90 minutes with me, you know what I mean, or bringing people together so that they can watch me, on a stage for, an hour and a half.
But what about a version of yourself? I mean, that's what I love, is sort of creating a version of myself. I created a very glamorous version of myself and had Annette Bening play her. And there was something fantastic about that, so that you take, I agree that we have large issues that we want to explore, and that we're playwrights because we have an imagination, but there is sort of a thrill about taking that imagination and either turning yourself into a goddess or turning yourself into a creep and seeing what happens. So I'm just suggesting maybe that's something that would give you enormous pleasure to do, just because it helps you understand yourself, and it helps you get revenge, and it helps you make people laugh, and it sort of entertains an audience.
I think that's very much what my arc as a playwright is going to be, is probably increasingly, getting behind this idea that I am writing about myself. You know what I mean? And therefore allowing myself to be really creative really, sort of to refract the vision of myself.
And the disguises you create. Yeah. That's the whole joy.
Yeah.
It's those fabulous scales and feathers that you put on yourself.
Well, as we talk about self, obviously the motivating idea behind the book, The Play That Changed My Life, was to talk about influences. And Tina, you began to talk about your family, and Diana, you mentioned your family as well, and kind of the environment in which you were raised. So let me ask more explicitly, where was theater in your life as a child, as a teenager? Ultimately, you write in the book about an experience that you had in 12th grade. Tina, you write about something that happened once you graduated college. But prior to those events, was theater a part of your life? Was theater where you thought you were headed? I'll ask Diana first.
Oh, absolutely not, because there was no theater where I grew up. I grew up in Dover, Delaware. It's a very small town. I think maybe there might have been some theater going on in Wilmington, but that was an hour away. And my parents were Korean immigrants. We owned a drugstore in an even smaller town, about half an hour south of there. So our life was just like work and home and school.
And presumably TV.
TV, I watched a lot of TV. I watched a lot of TV. That was my cultural experience. And then, as I got older, movies. But I did not, my parents never took me to theater. My parents never took me on vacation, So when I went, as a high school senior to see a play for the first time, as I wrote, that it was completely transformative.
Well, we'll come back to this specific play. Tina, you had a very different upbringing.
Yeah, but like Diana, theater was not part of my upbringing.
You were raised here in New York,
I was raised in New York City, and my father, Quincy Howe, did the evening news on CBS Radio. He was a news commentator, meaning that he both wrote the news and delivered it. And he came from a very literary family, so all of the conversation was about belles lettres. There were poets in my family, biographers, novelists. It was all about the written word. And I think my parents took me to see The Red Barn, The Red Mill by Victor Herbert, with people in costumes twirling around the stage, and it made absolutely no impression on me. But I think because my father was a sort of a very serious Calvinistic suffering Brahmin that he loved the Marx Brothers because the Marx Brothers movies gave you license to surrender to the absurd and to laugh yourself into a soup. And so on the weekends, to sort of relax from our very high-minded weekdays, we always went to the Marx Brother movies. And that, to me, you know, seeing all of that sort of mayhem that was allowed, encouraged, and appreciated, that was huge. For me, you know, my big moment was when I lived in Paris for a year and walked into the Théâtre de la Huchette and saw the Bald Soprano, because the behavior was so akin to the behavior in my house with all of these high-minded people who kept talking all the time. But in this case, the language flew out of control, and it made everybody laugh. And the audience was in stitches as the characters, you know, courageously soldiered on. And I thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. I want to be able to live in a world where I can create this kind of mayhem for people to watch in a dark room. Mm-hmm. So it was odd.
I overlooked one experience that actually I mentioned in the essay, which is I had this family friend, who I called Uncle Don Horowitz, and he was married to a Korean woman that my mom had known in Korea. And they lived in Delaware too, and he was a total theater buff, and he acted in the local community, community singers productions, and he was going to play Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. So we had to go. So that was, in fact, really the first play I ever saw. It was a musical, right? But I went to see Uncle Don play Tevye. And
Fiddler on the Roof was actually the first professional show I ever saw.
Is that
but
right?
as a Jewish kid, it was pretty obvious that I did too.
Right. And then the next summer, then he was in My Fair Lady at a smaller role. But anyway, he said, "Do you want to work backstage?" And it was summer, and I was bored. Right. Summer was just deadly boring because my parents were at work all day, and it was either go to work with them, you know, or stay home. So I volunteered to work backstage, and so really, my second experience in the theater was then being, you know, behind the curtain. And that was really fascinating to me. I mean, of course, you know, you're sitting in rehearsal, you're bored, you know, but I did, you know, I was pretty enchanted by and mesmerized by that transformation of these people. And because also Dover is pretty, like, small town and kind of rural, so these people would come in with like big boots and flannel shirts, and, you know, even the women and stuff, and then they'd put on these, you know, the costumes from My Fair Lady. It was influential, but it didn't totally, push me into theater. Yeah, it was just like sort of like, that's intriguing, you know. But when it was over, I didn't think, I've got to get back, be a stagehand again.
Well, but your story about Hamlet, about reading Hamlet, and your identification with the young, struggling, unhappy teenager, and then seeing Diane Venora, I just loved what you wrote, your essay about the play that changed your life, because it was so vivid. And who thinks of Hamlet as being a contemporary? I just love that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, what's also interesting is that in some ways that experience for you was accidental, because I don't want to give away the whole story, but it was accidental in the sense that when your teacher learned that Hamlet was being played by a man, if she could have, she'd have returned the tickets, and you wouldn't have had that experience.
She said, yeah. She said, "Oops, it's too late."
Yeah.
So it's remarkable what hits you. This is going to be my closest moment to doing Gotcha TV, but I want to read you an email that I received yesterday. We've certainly started hearing from people who've read the book, and let me just read. Miss Son's writing is captivating. Her story was like watching a movie, so clear, precise, emotionally engaging. It brought me back to that time in my life when everything in it felt impossible, painful, desperate, and thrilling all at once. It's a privilege to have made such an impression on this passionately gifted writer. This is from Diane Venora.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's great.
So, you know, what I wanted to ask in the way of that is, do you have the experience of people writing to you or trying to reach out to you and wanting to tell you not only that your play has moved them, but why?
Yes. Yes.
What do you-
Standing in line at Fairway, some person will come up to me and say, Miss Howe, could you reach that box of cereal because you're so tall? No, yeah, people do, yes, yeah. And you're always sort of stunned and grateful and say, would you say it again, please?
Right.
It's, yeah, I think my fans tend to be women because, you know, I've been writing so clearly about female experience.
I mean, I think I tend to hear from people via email, because that's sort of, you know, a little bit more of...
Well, you're in Brooklyn. You didn't
Yeah.
realize
Oh,
Fairway
come
was
to
the place
Fairway
to
with
be.
me. Come to Fairway.
I'll take it to Fairway Red Hook. But people find me on email and also, you know, via Facebook, you know. And so you do hear from people who really, you know, are not connected to you at all and saw a production in Kentucky, you know, or they did it in their college. Or, I mean, I'm actually thrilled at the number of small theaters and small town theaters that do Stop Kiss. It's really, it's very inspiring and gratifying. But I do hear from those people.
Again, one of the more interesting things that came out in the book, and you should explain that everybody wrote in isolation. It's not that we gave anybody anything other than the topic. You all didn't know who else was going to be in the book with you. And there are themes that come through. And one of the themes that I was delighted that came through is the breadth of theater in the United States. How many of the writers wrote about community theater? You know, community theater is considered a pejorative by so many professionals. And people like Beth Henley and Sarah Rule were writing about that this is where they, you know, became known. So as you say, it's remarkable. I mean, when you get that royalty statement once every 6 months, that's when you get to look at the list and know where your play is done, because you don't always know, I assume. You don't know where each and every production of your play is, and then you might go, good gosh, you know,
But then,
Mississippi?
in a way, there's community theater in New York because there's off Broadway, and you know, writers get homes in those small theaters that that don't cast their plays with stars and where there's not tons of money. But it seems to me that community theater exists in a way in small rooms and basements in New York City. I mean, it's a slightly different contract. It may not be a LORT contract, but I feel that I feel that that theater is not simply Broadway and off Broadway, but there's other theater going on at the same time.
We've talked about parents and family and upbringing, and we've touched upon the plays that you wrote your essays about. There is a teacher who's prominent in your essay, both for good and, you know, not for ill really, but as I said, probably not as broad-minded as some people say. I had a teacher who opened my eyes. So I wanted to ask you both about teachers that you may have had, be it in high school, be it in college, and their impact on your moving towards careers in the theater.
I mean, I've had teachers all along the way. I mean, I can directly map my path to being here to teachers. You know, so when I was 9 years old and in the 4th grade, and I also had an older brother, you know, whom I was overlooked for. And every year, you know, at elementary school, I'd get a new teacher, and on the first day of school, they'd go and go down the roster and say, "Oh, and Diana Son, Diana Son, are you Grant's son's sister? I hope you'll be as good of a student as Grant's son was." And you know, obviously, it's absolutely devastating to your self-esteem and your sense of self, right? So in the 4th grade, I had this teacher, Mrs. Russell. And we had this assignment around Thanksgiving to write about what you were thankful for. And she said, I really want you to think about it. I really want you to, you know, find something in your life that you're thankful for. So I went home and I wrote that I was thankful for my family, including my brother, who was really the bane of my childhood.
Wow.
And I went back, you know, turned it in, and we ran out to recess. And when we came back, a teacher had read our essays, and she said, you know, I'm so disappointed in all of you. You know, I asked you to really think about this and find something that had meaning to you. Everyone wrote about their toys and their games and their bicycles and their clothes, and only one student wrote about something that really had meaning to them. And that student is Diana Son, and I'm going to hang her essay up on the wall so everyone can read it. Now, I always say the story of my life is she never did. But I mean, that was it. I decided then I was going to be a writer, and I never changed my mind. You know, and then in high school I had Mrs. Levitt. She took, you know, as a high school senior, she took me to see Hamlet. I thought, I want to be a playwright. I want to go to NYU because I went to the public theater, which was next to NYU. At NYU, I had a seminal teacher named Una Chowdhury who totally introduced me to Ionesco and Genet and, you know, Peter Weiss and, you know, all these amazing, you know, European experimental playwrights. And that is also, that's what I fell in love with. What Fiddler Ruth didn't do to me then, you know, Ionesco did for me later.
Tina, teachers?
I never had a mentor, and I sometimes get very misty-eyed around those that did. I was a bad student in high school. The one sort of looming figure in high school, how do I say this? My father was blacklisted and left CBS and took a job essentially teaching the New York Times at the University of Illinois. And the University of Illinois had a lab school connected to it where they would experiment with different educational programs, and the lab school was called University High School. And I was always a bad student, but because I had this well-known father, they had to let me in. And so I went to Uni High and continued to get bad grades because I never figured out the connection between class and homework. I never figured out that you were supposed to do anything after you were through with the class, and so I was not a good student. But our drama teacher was Wilfred Leach, who was getting his PhD at the University of Illinois, and I remember he staged one of his plays called something like The Zodiac of Memphis Street. And I was never cast because I was too tall and weird, but I admired him from the sidelines and would see my other friends, you know, and I never studied with him. And then when I went to Sarah Lawrence, lo and behold, there he was. And he taught, I think, a class in costume. And I took it because it was Wilfred Leach, but I never knew I had any voice, and I never, you know, studied playwriting with him. And after Sarah Lawrence, I mean, I wrote a little play in Sarah Lawrence just because I had to write something for my senior year, and my big moment was that Jane Alexander decided to direct it, this terrible little play about the end of the world with pigeons and kings and queens, and it was so pretentious, like Beckett, who I had never read, so you can imagine how terrible it was. But because it was Sarah Lawrence and about the end of the world, it was a triumph, and everybody screamed, "Author, author," and I ran up to the stage and threw kisses until they pulled me off with the hook. And then my father said, "I'll either send you to Europe for a year or graduate school," and I always loved Paris and anything French. And so I went to, Jane and I sailed to Europe together on a little student boat, and her ultimate goal was Edinburgh to study mathematics, and mine was the Sorbonne to study philosophy. And within 2 weeks, Jane was acting in the Fringe, and I was writing my first full-length play, never having studied playwriting. But it was seeing the Bal Soprano that absolutely dazzled me. And I think where I learned my craft, whatever my craft is, was when I came back to the States, I got married, and to put my husband through both college and graduate school, I became a high school English teacher. And it wasn't enough to have 4 preparations a day. You also had to run an extracurricular activity. And at both the school in Maine and in Wisconsin, they asked if I would run the theater club. And I said, "Oh yes, but only if I can write all the plays." And they were so desperate, they said, "Okay." And so I began writing plays for my students and directing them. And if you can hold a gymnasium full of 1,000, you know, hormonally wild teenagers, you can do pretty much anything. And that's where I learned my craft, is writing these plays for teenagers. And I have always longed for some bearded professor to pat me on the head and enfold me in his robes and tell me how wonderful I am, but I've never had that.
Interesting. Yet, there may be, as you say, 1,000 kids who sat in the auditorium and saw your early plays, probably, you know, not knowing that this was not the usual drama club activity, and that usually you were doing, you can't take it with you.
Well, and I realized the only way to keep them seated and quiet was to put the violence on the stage. So I wrote a very violent Christmas play where Santa Claus goes into a department store with a shotgun and starts killing all of the shoppers. And then when I was teaching in Bath, Maine, Bath is the battleship building, empire of the United States. I wrote an anti-war play about a bomb shelter that was big enough to hold 5 people, and 6 people end up in it. And so I did this anti-war play in this town where all of my students' parents worked at the Bath Iron Works building battleships. And it was a triumph. So,
Do you ever go back and look at your early works? Did you save your early works? I mean, do you have your 4th grade essay? Do you have the very first play you ever tried to write? And do you look at it and...
I have it, but I don't look at it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I have it.
So they're there somewhere.
Yeah, it's hard to...
Oh, please, yeah.
But, it's interesting because as you talk about influences and you were writing, I mean, we would call what you were writing in some ways site-specific theater. Because
Yes.
you were writing for a particular audience in a particular
Right.
place to serve a particular purpose rather than simply exploring what most interested you. So,
And the other thing that I find, I was very moved by Sarah Ruhl's essay where she says that theater essentially is about loss. And I was thinking that because of those years of going to the Marx Brothers movie, for me, theater is essentially about making people laugh. Theater is essentially about the comic impulse, falling on a banana peel. And I don't know, I think that's something that has been very informative for me, in my writing my plays, trying to make my young students laugh, trying to keep them entertained. And that has always been my impulse, which is why I often cast an envious eye at all of those writers who have gone to Yale and NYU and studied playwriting in a legitimate, serious, thoughtful way. And I see myself as this sort of burlesque character who basically just wants to throw banana peels on the stage. And it's strange.
and as we talk about studies, if I recall correctly, though you went to you didn't go to Tisch.
Right.
You actually went to NYU and got essentially an English degree in dramatic literature, but not in playwriting.
Yeah, because I really had to read plays, before I was going to write them. I thought, also, my parents would never have let me apply to the Tisch School of the Arts. So I did. I graduated, with a literature degree. And that's where, my influential professor taught. But I, also have not had a playwriting mentor, and I haven't studied playwriting. But I think that's the kind of beauty, of the theater and playwriting, which is like the creation, of the play, involves the form as much as the content. There really is no matrix that you're following, every time. That's for me, because I also write for TV, which is very, which has a very set structure. Playwriting is, is the more challenging.
Yes.
And the more creative.
Well, why were you drawn to playwriting? As a writer, there are many forms in which one can write. Why do you think that is what you were chosen, or you chose to express yourself through?
I think for me, it very much had to be with being in the same room as the actors, and also feeling in some way. There was a communal, experience. It was sort of like we are all agreeing, to suspend, disbelief, and watch this play and believe what's happening. Oh, that's a ghost. Doesn't look like a ghost to me, but we're going to say it's a ghost, and we're going to experience that character as a ghost, as somebody with this longing and this inability to connect with who he wants to connect with, and also as I became a more experienced theater goer, is you can feel the audience, so you can tell what parts that they're reacting to, even if they're not laughing or crying, but you can feel ooh, the audience is a little afraid to go there, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or the audience is totally opening up to that, and that's, you don't get it in TV and film.
No, because people are sitting on
Yeah,
the
you're
sofa
watching
or
on
in
your
a theater.
VCR, you're online,
But Tina, is that the case for you? Because you came from a very literary family.
Well, and I wanted to write fiction, and I took short story writing classes at Sarah Lawrence, but there were too many words to choose from. She glided into the room, she inserted herself into the room, she stumbled into the room, she waltzed into the room, and so my writing was terrible, and they made a little rubber stamp, worst in class, donk, and put it right on my forehead, and I didn't have the gift. But yet everyone in my family they were all writers, and so I thought, well, I want to write, and I want to make people laugh. Those were my impulses, because somehow when we went to the Marx Brothers movies and we were all laughing, we were safe. And so I always equated making people laugh and shedding all those anxieties and not dealing with loss, but dealing with the improbable, that became huge for me. And so that was sort of, it wasn't so much the communal, and my husband had been studying acting, and he was really an actor, and he went to the neighborhood playhouse, and he was really smitten by show business. I never was. Because all of my antecedents were these poets and novelists and essayists, and for me it was belles lettres, and I always have felt like the black sheep of the family because I'm in show business. My cousin Fannie Howe just won a $100,000 prize for her poetry, and Suki and Fannie are both professor emeritus's at important universities with their poetry, and here I am, writing plays about couples that have children that are played by large hairy men, and so I've always felt like sort of an outsider and not a real theater person, that I wish I could. If I had the choice of being either Virginia Woolf or Tennessee Williams, I would be Virginia Woolf in a heartbeat. If I could write like that, that's what I would long to do. But because I can't, then I decide, well, maybe if I can sort of create characters like Harpo and Groucho and Chico at the piano and have things fly apart. It's not violence, it's anarchy, which is different. But there's something in me that is very drawn to that. When I saw Chuck Mee's Big Love with the brides hurling themselves on the floor, I just burst into tears, sobbing uncontrollably. And I thought, oh dear me, something is very wrong in my wiring. But I think it's that in the theater you have license to go haywire and to go to the bitter end. And that's, UNESCO talks about paroxysm and going to the unendurable. And I think there's something in that speaks to me very strongly.
Interesting. Not to be blatant in bringing up the book again, but I am curious, as you read through it and saw what others wrote, you mentioned responding, to some of the pieces. Were there things that surprised you about the influences of these other playwrights, many of whom you may have known, certainly prior to reading this?
I think what got me the most, and you'll love this, is how beautifully written all of the essays were. And I thought, because so much of playwriting is about the art of not saying what should be said. It's about the art of evocation and of not naming what is so obvious. And so I was very impressed and very moved by how beautifully written all of these essays were, and how the narrative was so strong, and that everyone had a very particular story to tell, and they were so beautifully written. And I thought, wow, these are playwrights, and they really know how to handle the English language, and it's not just characters screaming at each other or falling down. But I just thought it was a wonderful read, a really wonderful read.
But it's interesting, until you said that, I never thought about the fact that perhaps what we were asking was a perverse act.
Yes.
Because my assumption was they are writers, they know how to express themselves. So while we were not asking the right plays, though I sort of thought somebody might come in with one that was actually written in script form, none of that happened, and everyone participated in that way. But listening to this conversation, I'm going, I guess it's not the most natural thing. It's not that you just say, okay, I can write in this form or this form or this form.
And the answers were very thoughtful. I was very impressed with how, the amount of thought and the amount of sort of, scouring memory and going back to those moments, and then the care that was taken in recreating the moment when the candle flared. I was very impressed with that. I thought it was really fascinating. Also because playwrights hide. I love to use this expression that I am a reluctant exhibitionist. That I love flaunting my imagination, but at the same time, I don't like to be seen. I don't like to be photographed. I like to sort of hide under the chair, and I think many of us do. And yet, in this book, I think we all stepped forward and were very honest and very overt and revealed a great deal, but with a lot of artistry. It's a wonderful read.
I think, the playwrights were most comfortable at the back of the theater.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's with the audience facing away from us.
Yes.
But writing, this essay, at least for me, it was so, and I write in this, I don't write at home because I have 3 children. I would never get anything done. And, I write in this writing space and with some other people, and it's pretty dark, and it's just sort of like, the world of your little lamp, that's sort of, and you block everything else out around it. And it was a very intimate experience for me writing this. It felt very, it felt one-on-one, which it was, Tina, when you were talking about, I don't know why, the Marx Brothers, but before, it sort of made me think also about that difference between film and theater, and how in the theater, I also feel like, and maybe it's related to what my first experience was, that in a way, what the characters are saying to the audience is, I see you, right? That's what's so crucial about that, the fact that we're all there together, is the characters, not the actors, but the characters are saying, I see you. And that's, that's just inimitable.
Do you think that's true in all plays? I mean, obviously in the case of Hamlet, it's a play with soliloquies. Maybe he's talking to himself, but you understand that he's speaking to the audience. Shakespeare has those direct addresses. Do you think all characters are aware of the audience they're speaking to?
Not in that literal way, where they break the wall and face you, but I think it's in the stories that are being told, really, and the people that are being embodied. It's like if you go to the theater. I was thinking about this the other day. Is that somebody, said to me after seeing Satellites, and she was a Caucasian woman with an African American husband, and she said, and she's a generation older than me. She says, I feel like you put a microphone in my house. You know what I mean? And those conversations that those two people had were created. I didn't record my husband and I, one night and then just type it. You know what I mean? Like, I had to imagine, what would it be like for this African American man to live in an African American community for the first time? Because he's in the play, he's adopted. He was raised by white parents in a white neighborhood. So the stories of these 2 people disconnected from their pasts who have a baby, right? But I remember thinking that it was just the most gratifying, much more interesting to me than that play's so about you, I could so see you in it, was the idea that somebody who I did not know saying to me, I feel like, you wrote that play about me.
We've talked about parents, we've talked about teachers, we've talked about productions. Have you had the opportunity, or do you want the opportunity, to be mentors to another generation of playwrights? Is that something that you are a part of?
Yeah, I definitely am. I've been teaching playwriting in the graduate theater department at Hunter since 1990, and before that I taught at NYU. A lot of my friends are young playwrights. I've been very involved with the 13 Ps, and I find it so odd that my best friends tend to be former students and the young, and that I get very involved with them, that I feel a tremendous responsibility for them, and basically I'm rather antisocial, but when a student calls and says, oh, can I see you, and I have some ideas, and I always drop everything. So no, I'm very involved with the young, very, yeah, hugely.
I love to teach. I don't have the the time to teach, full time on a university because I have 3 young kids, and and I'm, a working parent. But I have done fellowships through the Dramatists Guild, which I love, and I have also sort of taught workshops through New George's, which is a small theater company here in New York. Whenever I can, I do. I think it's important. I mean, I think also especially, because we didn't have mentors.
That's just what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So we become one. I get a cloak and I get a beard and a gruff voice and very heavy horn-rimmed glasses so that I can wrap my arms around my students and be avuncular and wise. No, it's huge.
Yeah. When I can, I do. I actually got a chance last spring to teach at NYU to the grad students too, and I just love it.
There are people who look at playwriting by young playwrights in particular and say that the influence of film and television has really infiltrated the theater. And so when either in your own work, do you feel that's the case? And when you're working with younger playwrights, do you feel that they're coming from a different place and you need to show them the possibilities that theater offers beyond the literalness of television and film?
I mean, that wasn't my experience at NYU. I mean, I felt like all of those writers were really writing theatrically, even though a lot of them weren't playwriting majors. They were really, the plays were expansive and imaginative, and not at all like TV scripts. Because people ask me to teach TV writing, and I say, why would I teach TV writing? You just watch TV and read a couple of those scripts, and then you know what I mean? And also, there's just no fun in it for me, quite frankly. If I'm going to do that, then I want to get paid a lot of money.
But I find, when I began teaching at NYU, I found that the students were writing plays in very short scenes. And I remember Heather McDonald had written a play called Faulkner's Bicycle that had been done at Yale, and she had moved on and was writing a different play in my class. But she said, "Would you read it? 80 scenes, a play in 80 one-page scenes," and it was beautifully written. And I said, "Heather, I don't understand. It's beautifully written, but I don't think I get it." And I talked about it in class to the rest of the class, and I said, "What's wrong with me?" And they said, "Oh, Tina, you don't understand. We have very short attention spans, and we watch a lot of TV, and we see things, that they keep shifting and moving, and this is how we tend to write." And then a couple of years later, Faulkner's Bicycle was produced at the Joyce Theater, and I saw it, and it was ravishing, and I understood it. I completely understood it, and it was sort of a shift. I mean, you look at dear Eugene O'Neill with his relentless acts that churn and grow on themselves, these churning, 80-page acts that go on and on with no break. And then you suddenly are reading these very sort of quixotic, quicksilver scenes that these young writers are writing. And I still feel today they're doing the same thing, that the scenes are much shorter. And so that I feel my job as a teacher is to be a sort of a very large mirror that I put up in front of the student, so that when they look at me, they see their own work reflected back to them, and that my job is to get them to write the play that they want to write, whether it is in 80 scenes or whether it is in 4 scenes. So I think it's very tricky because you have to be sensitive to their velocity. And if they do the long crunching plays, or if they're more nervous and sort of jumpy and want to write in shorter scenes, that our job is to sort of figure out what the play wants to be and to help them make that happen. But I think the writing is very different. And now there are these 90-minute intermissionless plays. Oh, I could go on for hours.
I mean, people have said that about my writing, like, oh, it has this TV-like poppiness. And this was even before I started to write for television, right? People said that about Stop Kiss. And I thought, I'm sure I'm influenced by television. I mean, that's what I grew up watching. But I think, and I, sort of write about, pop music, post-punk pop music in my essay, because that was so influential on me, and I think that that has to be taken into account too, is that songs all of a sudden went from 5.5 to 6 minutes, or really in the sort of the era of bands like Yes and Renaissance. I mean, those songs were 12, 15 minutes.
They were the entire side
and
of an album
yes,
when they
exactly.
were still albums.
And then all of a sudden, you had Elvis Costello, with like 26 songs on an album, so all of a sudden the music also got very condensed, and more hard driving and shorter. And I think for me I think that's as much a part of my aesthetic, as this 3-minute TV scenes.
As playwrights, do you always have your next play in mind, or do you have to work to think what's going to be the next play?
Well, I have a lot of time in between my plays because, again, I have 3 young kids, and I also write for television to, support my family. So I don't get to work on my plays as much as I want, and so there is a long gestation period. I mean, I am writing a new play now, and it was sparked by something. You have to feel like it's got to be something that just brings together a lot of different things that that are very alive to you at that time, and that you're trying to sort out. Right? Because I think what really attracts you is some idea that makes you think, by the end of this play, I am going to know and feel something that I can't understand right now. I couldn't even wrap my head around right now. And so because I'm also, I'm writing a pilot right now that it's in the back of my mind, you know what I mean? So, but I do need a long gestation period.
Yeah, and I think each play leads to the next in some strange way, and I find that I tend to write small plays that are in a teacup, and then the next impulse is to write a really large play with a huge cast, and it sort of flips back and forth. I also think that as a playwright, you have to be working on another play when you go into production to protect you from the inevitable catastrophe that will result when the play opens, so that most of us are always working on something. Whether it's any good or not is sort of not the issue, but we have to keep we have to stay inspired, and we have to hope and believe that something new and fantastic is bubbling up under the surface. So yeah, I think almost all of us are working on something.
Well, I want to thank you both for being part of this discussion. I want to thank you for being part of the American Theater Wing's book, The Play That Changed My Life. It is an infinitely richer book for you both being a part of it. So thank you for that. Thank you for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, I'm Howard Sherman, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.
I'm Ted Chapin, chairman of the American Theater Wing. The Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. Best known for creating the Tony Awards, we stand for excellence, but we also support education in the theater, and our work reaches beyond Broadway in New York. The Working in the Theater television programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelsin Foundation, are unequaled forums for discussions with today's most creative artists. Downstage Center's in-depth radio interviews were created in conjunction with XM Satellite Radio and can be heard on our website. Our annual theater company grants support New York not-for-profits, and since they began, have distributed nearly $3 million. We are also pleased to be the home of the Jonathan Larson Grants, which support emerging composers and lyricists. For people who are starting their careers, we have a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country called Springboard NYC. And our theater intern group provides a forum for young people who are starting their careers to build a professional network. All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free on demand from our website, americantheaterwing.org. Thanks for your interest in the Wing, and thanks for watching.